In this lecture, we're going to talk about bind mounting and persistent data in those mounts. And the requirements are really that you just know about container management, how to run containers. So let's jump in.
So let's talk about bind mounts, and they're actually pretty cool. When I first learned about them, it sort of gave me an aha of how I could use Docker easily for local development. So really, a bind mount is just a mapping of the host files or directories into a container file or directory. And you can do just that. You can either specify a directory or just a single file. In the background, it's basically just having the two locations point to the same physical locations on disk. Again, this actually skips the UFS like the other volumes do, so that it's not going to wipe out your host location when you delete the container. And if there are any files in the container that you map the host files to, the host files win. Now, it doesn't actually delete the files in the container that it overwrote, because it's not really overwriting anything in the container. It's just there while the bind mount exists. So the minute you don't need the bind mount anymore and you rerun the container without it, you would actually see the underlying data that was there before. And because bind mounts are usually host specific, they need specific data to be on the hard drive of the host in order to work. You can't specify them in a Docker file. You have to use them at runtime when you use the Docker container run command. And you can see the format here. It's really the -v that we used before, only on the left side of the colon, we're actually putting in a full path rather than just a name. And the way that Docker actually can tell the difference between a named volume like we did a while ago and the bind mount is the bind mount starts with a /. And on Windows, you'll notice that it's a 2 // and then the drive letter and then your path. So as long as you have the left, colon, and right sides, you can really map anything you want from the host into the container. And you can also specify things like read-only. Now, where this really comes to shine is with development and running services inside your container that are accessing files you're using on your host or changing. So let's do that with Nginx. So if you go to the root of our repository for this course, and then we go into the Dockerfile sample2 directory. Now, we were in here earlier, and if you remember, there's two files. And this is for Nginx, right? So if we look at the Docker file real quick, it's pretty simple. It's just specifying a working directory and then copying an index file into that directory. Now, there's no volumes here. A bind mount doesn't require a volume to work, although one could certainly be there, but the host always wins, remember? So when we're doing a Docker container run, then we do a -d, let's name it Nginx. Let's give it the port 8080 like before. And then we're going to give it the volume this time. And I need to tell it my current working directory is going to be actually mounted into that working directory in the container. Because my index file is here in this folder, I want it to be in the container so I can edit it here and it is seen live in the container. So it'll make sense in a second. Here's a quick little tip. Instead of me having to figure out my whole path and typing the whole thing in, you can use pwd here like so, which is a shell shortcut that says print out the working directory and replace this command with that path. And then we're just going to use the same working directory from the Docker file there. And then we're going to specify the Nginx image. Now, what I'm going to do real quick is I'm actually going to open up another terminal window so we can do two things at once. And you don't really need to do this. Basically, we're just going to edit the file on our host, and then I'm going to be in the container and see what's happening. So just to make sure it's working, let's go to localhost. Okay, so this isn't the default Nginx HTML file. And we used the regular Nginx image. We didn't actually use the custom one from this directory. We just used a stock image. And to prove that point, we can actually do that same exact command again, but take out the -v, and I'll run it on port 8080 instead, and I'll call this one Nginx 2. And if I go over to my browser and go to localhost 8080, that's the default Nginx index.html file. This one is the custom one that we have living in this directory. So already we can see that it mapped it correctly. And if I open up another tab here and get a command line in the container. And then go to that directory. You'll notice that we can actually see the Docker file because we mapped the whole directory. So if over on the left, if we actually made a new file, and I can just use the Linux touch command here to create a new file, and then over on the right, oops, just keep forgetting that, ls-al, and you'll see that new file. So hopefully you understand what's going on here, that both these locations are the same location. And if I echoed something in to that test.me file, and then there you go. Our Nginx is able to see the changes because it's just a normal file path in the container, and those files are on the host. And if I was to delete them in the container, they would be deleted on the host because it is the same file. So this is when I usually get a developer to get mind thinking about all their development environments that they have that are this complicated setup. Maybe they're using Vagrant or some other manual method of setting up their perfect environment, and they can start to see how this could make that so much simpler. Because I didn't have to do any complicated setup on my Mac. I just ran a container. I used the -v command with the mount. And now my code on my host can be edited on my host. And I really never need to go into the shell of the container. Usually you can just run the container and look at its logs to see if there's any errors while you're coding. And of course, this is a simple example with Nginx. But later on, we're actually going to have specific examples of different development environments for local development in containers.